Chapter 4. I'd kill you if I could. Uncle Bill was a barber. He used to come over on Sunday afternoons for dinner, and afterward he cut the kids' hair. I listened from the vent in the floor upstairs, smelling the hot foods and cuddling up to the sense of security it all seems to provide. And when the haircuts were done, the dialogue rarely varied. "Well, Alice, why don't you bring Maury down," Uncle Bill suggested, "and we'll cut his hair too." Silas growled, angry at his older brother. "No way is that black bastard getting his hair cut." "Ah, come on, Si," Uncle Bill chided. "You crazy old bugger, let him come down." Cyrus cursed and refused. "He'll probably turn out to be the best damn kid you have," Uncle Bill teased. Cyrus exploded into fits of cursing. Uncle Bill was not intimidated. "Ah, lay off the kid, Si." One of these days, Cyrus shot back at him in a gravely voice. "I'll kill that black bastard." I shivered when I heard him, but I knew I was safe on Sundays. The old man never beat me when Uncle Bill was in the house, and in a moment, when Mum could slip away quietly, she advised me to drop by Uncle Bill's barber shop on the way home from school the next day. "Get out of there as quickly as you can, though, Maury," she told me, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. She found ways to avoid sending me away in the early days of her marriage, hoping that Cyrus would grow accustomed to my presence. He did not. He fumed incessantly whenever I was in view, cursing and growling like a chained alley dog. I never had an earliest recollection of his beating me. I could only remember being beaten, always being beaten. Cyrus drank heavily as Alice's accumulated problems now became his own. He stalked home from the tavern in the hotel downtown and fixed his drunken rage on me. While I was still an infant, Mum sometimes wrapped me in a blanket and walked the streets carrying me, waiting for Cyrus to spend his anger and collapse into a drunken sleep back home. I learned to walk in time, to learn to run. He would grab me by the arm and begin pounding on me until Mum could get to him and pull him away. If I squirmed away myself, I would eventually have to encounter him again. I learned that late payment was more severe than the immediate payment. I learned to go limp and let his big fist strike me at will. If I could not run to escape his noticing me in the first place, I could not run at all. Patterns emerged as Cyrus' alcoholism drove him to deeper and deeper hatred of me. As the dinner hour approached, he walked the same route home from work, via the tavern. I established hiding posts, a fence, a bush, or my favorite tree, just outside my solitary window, where I could conceal myself and watch him coming. I trembled as I peered out, gauging his drunkenness by his gait. Every evening I had to decide whether or not to slip home ahead of him by way of the well-worn shortcuts. If I was home when he arrived, I would be beaten ferociously. If he were in that frame of mind, I tried to determine by watching him secretly on his way home just how miserable he was, just how bad he was feeling, and just how likely he was to head straight for the bathroom or the bedroom once he got to the house. His drinking created terrible digestion problems for him, which sometimes forced him to skip my beating. On some nights, too, he was simply cranky, wanting his supper and wanting it now, rapping his cup on the table for a refill of tea, and looking around with a scowl and saying, "Where the blank is that paper I brought home?" But usually, if he were just uncomfortable enough to be enraged, I could be certain of a beating. Sometimes I decided to stay out, hoping that he would forget my absence and pass out for the night. I found places to sleep around the neighborhood, under a veranda, beneath a porch, in a thicket, or simply on the frozen earth of a neighbor's lawn or an empty lot. Many times a concerned neighbor would rouse me and take me inside, my teeth chattering and my flesh trembling with the cold. The neighbors knew full well what my fear of crazed Cyrus Wick had kept me from going inside. I never sat at the dinner table with the rest of the family, except on those rare occasions when Cyrus was not home for dinner. "Let that black bastard starve," he snorted when one of my brothers mentioned me as I listened from the vent on the upstairs landing. When they could, one of them would slip a few scraps of food to me afterwards, like the impish teenagers feeding the family mud on the sly. Sometimes they couldn't. And every evening as the dinner hour neared, the trauma began all over again. I could wait outside and face the weather and the horror of hiding, and hope that someone could sneak me some food, or I could go inside to the physical warmth and the frozen emotional tundra and face my chances with Cyrus. If I was in the bedroom as he came in, the terrible countdown began, as I heard him push his way in the front door downstairs. I stood in the darkness, having learned that it infuriated him to see me enjoying a normal lamplit room. I only tried to hide under the bed covers one time. Bunched up in a terrified ball in one corner of the bed, the electric terror pulsing through my skinny frame, He lurched up the stairs and into the blackened room. It was too dark to see anything, but Cyrus did not turn a light on. Instead, he began to hunt and search and curse in the darkness, groping wildly along the walls and under the bed and around the edges of the bed. "I'll find you, you black bastard," he said over and over between his gritted teeth, "and when I do, I'll kill you." My mind raced desperately. If I kept silent and hidden, he would eventually find me, and I knew he would beat me harder and longer for having to ferret me out. But I could not squeeze out a cry. I could not make myself call out to him and invite the horrible abuse. Suddenly, I felt his hot fingers make contact with my ankle. "I've got you now, you black bastard," he growled like an animal. He yanked me off the bed with a single snapping motion. In the next split second, I could see him silhouetted against the moonlight in the window, his rising fist above his head. I closed my eyes and waited for the blows to begin. Each impact crushed my face or my arms, until I felt myself fading away. The images and thoughts began melting together as I struggled to maintain consciousness. I could hear the voice of my brother Mark as he clung to Cyrus's pant leg, pleading with him to stop. But he pounded me again and again and again, then kicked me to the floor, then began punching me again. I could feel the cold wooden floor beneath me, and then the freezing steel bed frame against my face. Silas reared back and unleashed a final solid blow to the back of my head, and I was gone. I woke to feel the aching pulse throughout my body, beginning in my face where my skull had been butted up against the bed frame. My little brother Mark was cradling my throbbing head in his arms, looking down into my lumpy, bruised face. "Maury," he said softly, "are you all right?" I mumbled something through swollen lips. "Maury," Mark said in a terrified, breathy voice, "I thought you were dead." The revenge instinct fed his alcoholism, and his drinking heightened his thirst for revenge. They said he had suffered a terrible wound in World War I. A bullet ripped into the corner of his eye socket and passed through his head and out the back of his ear. But there was no evident scar. Some said he went away to war and came back a different person, somehow warped by the countless killings he witnessed as he crouched in the foxholes and scrambled for survival. Now I seemed to be the target of his irrational anger. He could never be satisfied with the damage he inflicted on me, and he almost stopped beating me at the very last moment, when he could not be sure of sparing my life. Then he would finally drop me to the floor, a number of ways still cursing and still reminding me, "I'd kill you if I could, you black bastard." But I was only the victimized symbol of Cyrus' hatred. The real vengeance he sought was against my mother Alice. I was the child she had loved, the offspring of the man she had loved, the man she had fled to and clung to instead of Cyrus, in that impassioned summer so many hot summers ago. She was horrified in the early days when he first began hitting me, and she always scurried to my defense, pulling me away from him and shouting down the old man. But as the years dragged by, her defenses sagged. He wore her down by his sheer consistency, by loading her up with insults of her own, calling her terrible names. She grew tired and numb, hopelessness seeping in. Life had never lightened up for her. The children she wanted Cyrus to care for were victims in their own ways as well. Rose, Jay, and Frank knew the old man as Uncle Si, although everyone called him the old man behind his back. They kept him at a distance, ignoring his rages and despising him generally. Times were tough for all of us. We boys slept together in one bed, with only Jay in a bed of his own as the oldest. Additionally, brothers Cyrus Jr. and Hal were soon added to the family, and we lay across the bed the wrong way just to fit everybody in. Sometimes my brothers hid me under their bodies when Cyrus was on a late-night rampage. Sometimes it worked. Across the landing, the girls' room was only a little better than ours. Baths were rarely taken. There was no tub in the house. Changes of socks and underwear were an unknown commodity. Instead of baths, we had the end. Our house was on the ridge beside the river. The ridge was supported by a cement wall, which ran in either direction from our place. At one end of the wall, the river had eaten away the cement, and the weakened structure had corroded and collapsed into huge chunks of concrete, which stood in the river like stubborn soldiers refusing to give up the fight. We often played among the rocks at the end, the closest we came to regular bathing, rarely thinking to remove our shoes and socks to keep them dry. With no dry replacements available, we simply threw the damp articles into the corner as we went to bed, and pulled them back on in the morning, musty and damp after a cold night, musty and stiff after a warm night. During warm weather, my feet grew sore for weeks at a time. I unwittingly administered the constant punishment of the end. Each child was responsible for his own laundry. It barely got done. When enough students had harassed me and enough teachers had sent notes home to my mother begging her to wash my clothes, I sometimes scooped up a few belongings and headed down to the river, where the town's children were accustomed to swimming. With red-faced shame, I scrubbed my clothes, while other kids jeered as they played in the water. We were the children other mothers advised their children not to play with, the family that the rest of the neighborhood wished were not here. As they looked at me, they knew I had somehow managed to be singled out as the old man's target of continual wrath. One day the old man marched home, livid with rage, belching his liquor and spilling out obscenities with every breath. He lurched down the cement steps behind the house, down into the cellar, snarling curses, and seized his axe by the handle. "Where is he?" he shouted as he huffed and puffed back up out of the cellar. "I'm going to kill that black bastard. Where is he?" I had seen him coming home down the street, sensing his unusual level of fury. I was hiding behind a hedge outside, and now I could see him, elbow his way out through the back door, clutching the axe handle and looking wildly from side to side. "Come here, you black bastard," he roared as he headed my way. I felt the shock of terror ripping through me, and for a moment I watched motionless as he stumbled in my direction, the axe blade glistening ominously. Then suddenly, as I realized he could cut me to pieces, I squirted out of my hiding place and flew down the street. He kept roaring angrily as I put more and more distance between myself and the terrible menace, until finally I ricocheted into someone's backyard, breathless and frightening and trembling, sobbing with fear. The neighbor lady poked her head out of the back door, her face drawn together in a tense frown. "Maury," she hissed, "come inside." She hid me for the night. The old man finally gave up the manhunt and crashed angrily back into his house, where he vomited loudly and passed out. I never knew the history. I never knew why he singled me out, why the hatred was focused on me. I knew only the hatred and the feeling of being unwanted. There's an inbred impulse in a child that longs for love, reaches out to security. When that reaching impulse fails to connect, it backs up inside the child like clogged sewage. Day after week after month, I felt the frenzy of unwantedness. I groped to understand it, to find out why this hunter hunted me, but I was too terrified, too fearful of my very life on a daily basis to ask anyone. I could only interrogate myself miserably in my solitude, and the anguish built up and found no relief. I was a trapped rat, and there was no escape from the frothing revenge of the old man, Cyrus Wick. When Mom was gone to her sister's house, or her mother's house, or to visit a neighbor, I agonized for my safety. And yet eventually I came to understand that Cyrus would never harm me when she was not around to hurt over it. It took years for me to fully understand the ugly dynamics of their relationship. But Cyrus had no need to lash out at me unless it would serve his sick and twisted purpose, to teach Alice a lifelong lesson of abject anguish. When she was within earshot, he rarely failed to abuse me, to point again verbally to that great crime she had committed against him, rejecting him and taking up with the mysterious Maury Blair. He taunted her in big ways and small. When the other children were handed ice cream on the lower level, Mom tried to wrangle a portion for me as I lay on my stomach at the air vent on the landing. Oh, she led off smoothly, trying to grease the chute. "Let me take some up to Maury." But Cyrus could not resist the bait. "Maury, give that black bastard some ice cream?" he snarled, scraping his chair away from the kitchen table and rising up like a grizzly aroused from sleep and unhappy about it. "Where the hell is he?" As he headed up the stairs, cursing as always, vowing to kill me, I leaped from my place on the floor and slipped to the far window of the bedroom, awaiting judgment. But Mom came after him, pulling him away and ridiculing him as best she could to draw his attention away from the target. Grumbling, still miffed, Cyrus reluctantly stopped on the landing, pulled his arm away from her angrily, and muttered a few final obscenities at her before clomping into his bedroom, dumping himself into the unkept bed. But it was all she could do. She could only on occasion stay his hand. The wall of revenge could never be scaled, not by any human means. Cyrus' distorted anger had built in too high, too thick. Mom could never throw a birthday party for the child Maury Blair, never express any open affection toward me, for fear of making a holocaust even more ferocious than it already was. Only one weapon could cut through the worst of times and bring a temporary halt to the fury: the name of Jesus, employed in something other than a curse. Cyrus mounted the steps at the end of a rainy spring day, vehement and noxious. He failed to make the turn on the landing and lumbered straight ahead to me, out of my desperate little corner. He struck blow after blow until finally he was fed up. Then he picked me up with his two monstrous hands and thrust me through the bedroom window. I hung in his grasp over the rain-swollen river below, which ran along the ridge just behind our house. I screamed, terrified of the fall in the water, but I was afraid to kick or squirm away. The dreadful ice-like fingers of Cyrus Wick were my only hope for survival. Mom heard the screams and came up the stairs. She stood in the doorway only for an instant, in virtual disbelief, then marched towards Cyrus with a fierce maternal determination. She sank her fingers into the scruff of his neck and said, "In the name of Jesus, pull that boy in and put him down." Her words were like bullets, clear and distinct. Cyrus froze. I could feel my heart pounding through my ribcage, waiting for movement, any kind of movement, something to tell me if he would toss me into the water like a scrap of garbage, or whether he would obey the unusual authoritative command of my mother. After an endless fraction of time, he drew me in back over the windowsill and let me drop to the floor. He would not look at Mom, but instead muttered a filthy word under his breath and stalked away. Mom waited for him to leave the room, then she turned to me. I was picking myself up, shaking badly, longing for her to take me in her arms and convince me it would never happen again, that she would protect me from that old man from now on. I wanted so much for someone to love me. But she patted my shoulder and looked at me with her big, sunken, doe-like eyes that declared her sadness but failed to console me. And once again the question that sounded so terribly absurd, "Maury, are you all right?" She barely waited for a response. She couldn't afford to. If she lingered with me, the grizzly would return. She knew it as well as I did. There would be no stolen embrace, no furtive moment of affection for the child. She was suffering hell herself, and she'd been trained to avoid the black bastard, until one spring day she sent me away.